There's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
In the last 15 years, nearly 100 prisoners serving life sentences have been released from prison, only to go on and commit another violent crime. Sometimes even murder.
This is all over Britain. They're just letting these dangerous killers out to kill again.
It is the job of the parole board and the probation service to determine whether prisoners can be safely released into the community and not re-offend.
Chris Killick defied his licence conditions within weeks of being released from jail.
But they don't always get it right.
I see time and time again when the system has failed.
How can that possibly be right? How can that possibly be protecting the public?
Whilst this represents less than 1% of the 25,000 cases reviewed by the parole board each year,
people are saying he will do something like this again. They were completely right.
these are some of the people who have lost loved ones as a result of murderers being released from prison to kill again.
We blame the justice system and the parole board. If anyone actually understood, then they'd do an awful lot more to prevent this from happening.
How is he allowed to do this again?
This is the portrait that my mum's dad actually painted of her, which is about 12 years old in the painting. And alongside, this is the picture of my mum when she was in her early 20s. There's family photos over here of all of us. There's 6 of us in total.
Amy and her 5 brothers and sisters are still trying to come to terms with the loss of their mother, Janet Scott, who was murdered a year ago by a man she started a relationship with.
My mum was married 4 times. She was looking for that fairy tale true love. It's in every single Disney film, but she struggled to find it.
She'd always wanted someone that she could just be with, someone that actually truly loved her for her.
My mum was going through a breakup. It was very messy. She was heartbroken.
But in April 2017, on a night out with her sister, Janet Scott is to meet a man who would change all that. Simon Mellors.
Mum was going out with her sister when she first met Simon. They ended up going for Chinese and talking because he'd made her laugh. Within the first couple of weeks, he was taking her out for drinks at pubs. Normal dates that you'd go on with someone that you were happy with.
I remember she dropped me a text saying that she's met a new fellow and she wants me to meet him. And she was a bundle of joy. She was so happy with herself that she had managed to get her back up on her feet.
Over the next few weeks, Janet and Simon Mellors start spending more and more time together.
He'd made her laugh. He'd made her feel happy.
Mellors tells Janet he's spent the last 12 years travelling the world and that he has 2 villas in Spain. But unbeknownst to her, it's all a lie. The truth is, he had been serving time in prison for the murder of his ex-partner, Pearl Black.
Pearl Black and Simon Mellors were in a relationship with each other for several years. They had 1 child together, and she already had a child from a previous relationship. After about 10 years, they split.
But Simon Mellors doesn't want the relationship to end.
He returns back to her house and attacked her, hit her over the head with an iron bar, which is very, very violent. To then make sure that they're dead by strangling them with bin liner ties is brutal. He then moved her into the bedroom, removed the handle of the door so that the children couldn't get into the room. He took the 2 children to school and then went on the run.
Mellors is arrested 2 days later and given a life sentence in 1999 for the murder of Pearl Black. But in 2008, a judge grants a 2-year reduction in his minimum jail term from 14 to 12 years. The victim's family write to the parole board, begging for him not to be released. But despite the family's concerns, Mellors was released on licence.
Simon Mellors was released on parole. He would have come under the care of a probation officer whom he would have had to meet and to talk about his life, what he was doing, and make sure that he was keeping to the terms of his probation. He told his probation officer that he was entering into a relationship with Janet Scott. The probation officer instructed him to tell Janet the fact that he was on probation for murder.
So 6 weeks into their relationship, Mellors finally revealed his dark secret to Janet.
He texted her an article, and that's how he said it. That he was a convicted murderer. She was really emotional about it. She rang me crying and going, Amy, I don't know what to do. This is the article that he's just sent me.
Mellors blames the murder on a mental breakdown and says he is now a reformed character.
I said to Mum there and then, I was like, what are you going to do if he's not rehabilitated? What are you going to do if he is actually psychotic? And she didn't know. She had no clue.
But by now, Janet has formed an attachment to Mellors and she finds it hard to leave him.
It was 8 or 9 weeks into the relationship, quite far gone. She'd already fallen for him.
People like Simon Mellors are manipulative. They're very good at disguising who they really are. Simon will have picked up on Janet's vulnerabilities. He won't have shown his true colours straight away because she would never have met him more than once had he have done that. And that's characteristic of a perpetrator.
He said to Mum, he was, yeah, if you don't want anything to do with me from here on, then fair dues, I'll leave. But that was not his intention in the slightest.
Over the last 15 years, more than 30 murderers have been released from prison to go on and kill again. 51-year-old Janet Scott from Nottingham has been dating convicted murderer Simon Mellors for 6 weeks when he confesses to her that he has served 12 years behind bars for strangling his ex-partner Pearl Black to death. He says he has reformed, but Janet's daughter Amy isn't convinced. Worried about her mother's safety, she sets up a meeting with the probation services.
It was a sit-down meeting with his probation officer. Mum and Simon were in the room as well. And he said to me, is there any worries that you have? And I said back, in your professional experience, is he going to do it again? And the probation officer actually looked at me for the first time in that entire meeting and went, I don't think so.
Reassured by the meeting with the probation officer, the relationship moves on and Mellors starts spending more and more time at Janet's house. Her children aren't happy, and it isn't long before they start noticing Mellors' controlling effect over their mother.
Felt like this was no longer Mum's or your house, it was his. Everything had changed. Like, everything in the kitchen wasn't in the cupboards that it used to be. He'd moved everything for his liking.
Control is the one thing that perpetrators have to have. Quite often there are triggers when the abuse will start, and those triggers often are moving in together, getting married, getting pregnant, and the reason for that is because those milestones show commitment from the victim.
He'd managed to make her fall for him, which she was very, very good at.
Over the next few months, the control Mellors has over Janet escalates.
He would be controlling over what she bought in the food shop, how much she'd spend when she was going into Primark, when she'd go out drinking, how much she'd spend on each of us, how often each of us were around the house, whether she'd be going out to go see one of us.
He was wearing her down a lot, and you could see it in her eyes.
She was completely and utterly trapped. He had her exactly where he wanted her.
The need for control by a perpetrator can get greater. It could be around food, so the victim may never have any money, or they're not allowed to go shopping on their own, or they're told what to buy, or they're not actually allowed to do the cooking.
It's only when his behaviour and the honeymoon stage started to spiral out about 9 months in that we saw him, truly.
We went for Christmas at my mum's that December before it happened. Me, Simon, Mum and my partner was playing a board game. I think it was me or Mum that won, and Simon went mental because of the fact that he lost it. He went mental. Now, my mum didn't tell me that she knew at that point what he was like.
The couple begin to argue a lot, and Janet tries to cool things off.
She said, look, we can be friends and that's it. I don't want to be in a romantic relationship.
But Mellors isn't taking no for an answer, and he starts following her to work on her night shift at a local supermarket.
A few days after that was the first time he started to stalk Mum on her way to work. Walking all the way up to the workplace, which scared her. I got a text message. Simon followed me on foot into Lidl, getting worried now. I mean, she says, Amy, I didn't know if he was going to whip out an axe, and that was going to be it there and then. And from that moment on, she didn't want anything to do with it.
Janet reports these incidents to the probation service. He is issued a warning, but the stalking doesn't stop.
One of the most dangerous points in time for any female is at the point of leaving a relationship or shortly after. Some people will go to extraordinary lengths to retain that control. And that sounds like what Simon Mellors did.
Then, 10 days later, on the morning of the 29th of January 2018, Mellors drives to Janet's house and waits for her while she sleeps following her night shift.
So she'd gone to bed for a couple of hours. He'd waited outside that entire time. He then unlocked the door with the key that he had cut, gone upstairs with a knife that he took from his property, and stabbed Mum twice. Once in the chest and once in the lower stomach and groin area. She had tried to get away. There was blood smeared across the set of drawers, bleeding out.
After that, he dragged her down the stairs and he convinced her to get in the car with him, drove her into the centre of Nottingham.
Petrified Mellors is going to kill her, Janet spots a traffic warden standing on the corner and seizes her opportunity to escape.
Just as he was about to turn into his property, Mum frantically ran from the car.
She jumped out of a moving car, whilst also so injured, was trying to do everything that she could to save herself.
Whilst the traffic officer tries to stem the flow of blood and keep Janet out of danger, Mellors doubles back, puts his foot on the pedal, accelerates, and then heads straight for the two of them at high speed. The traffic officer is thrown 15 metres in the air, and Janet is crushed between the car and brick wall behind her.
My dad just rang me. He goes, oh, I need you to come home now, in capital letters. So I went home, sat me down on the sofa. Dad tells me, held my hands and says, I'm so sorry, Hannah. Your mum's dead. Simon's killed your mum. Straight down into my dad's arms. crying for nights on end.
Right here is where Mum fled from the car after we'd come up to see it the day after everything had happened. And they'd only just removed the tent and moved Mum's body from the pavement to the coroner's. At which point, we were walking up the street and there was some guy there hosing blood off the wall into the drain. To see your mum's blood washing into a drain as if it's graffiti or any dirt on the road, that broke us even more.
Just knowing that that road still exists, it's like a little burden. You don't want it to be there anymore. Something bad's happened.
I had to identify her by the cards left in her purse and dental records and hair DNA, because she didn't have a face anymore because of what he did. Her entire torso was gone.
On the 31st of January 2018, 2 days later, Mellors is arrested and charged with the murder of Janet Scott. He is also charged with the attempted murder of the traffic officer who tried to save her life.
The traffic warden was badly injured. He broke quite a few bones in his back, and he was hospitalised for quite a long time.
Mellors is held in remand at Strangeways Prison awaiting trial. But rather than face up to his crime and the prospect of more time behind bars, he deals the final blow to the family by hanging himself.
Simon committed suicide when he was awaiting his trial, and he would have known that that would have been just the end of the story for him. He would have spent the rest of his life in prison. His own suicide speaks to kind of loss of control, inability really to take responsibility for what he's done.
There's a note left in that he admitted fault. He admitted what he was going to do. Somehow, he was let off 24-hour watch in prison, and as soon as it was, he killed himself. He hung himself in prison.
Family of Janet Scott would never have been able to get justice because he's dead. That meant that his case never went to trial and is marked as a concluded case. With no trial, there's no official verdict of him being found guilty. That kind of lack of resolution stops people from being able to move on because there's no closure. They would be, I imagine, lingering on the fact of the violent death, but also the systemic neglect that enabled it to happen in the first place.
My blood boils to this day. We wanted him to go through prison and serve life, but he's took his own life. We didn't get the justice that we deserved.
He's never gonna have to suffer a sentence and have to actually be held accountable because they let him die.
Janet's family want answers as to why the parole board considered their mother's killer safe enough to be released from prison and why he wasn't properly monitored by the probation service on his release. Another person looking for answers is Matt from Dundee, whose wife Linda was the victim of a convicted murderer who viciously attacked her whilst on home leave a week before his release.
That day, I got a phone call from my daughter and she just said, "Dad, have you heard from Mum today? Because there's something on Facebook. There's something happened up in Templeton Woods." When I come into the house, Linda wasn't in. So her shoes were on the deck, and so I knew she was in the woods. When I opened that gate that day, there was people coming. I would just come out the gate. There was people walking down here and said, "You'll not be able to get up there because somebody's been attacked." And I just asked if I was a woman. And they said, "Are you Matt?" I says, "Yeah." He says, "Matt, it's your wife, Linda." When they eventually brought Linda out, There was like, she was totally covered in blood. But eventually got to the hospital. She got wheeled out the ambulance. And at that point, I just seen my kids and I just crumpled, collapsed.
The doctors work round the clock to try and save his wife, Linda. And miraculously, she survives.
I really thought I was going to die. I didn't want to die and prayed to God, please God, I don't want to leave my family.
Linda's battered body is discovered by dog walkers, having been alerted by her screams.
It was a beautiful, beautiful, really, really warm, hot, sunny day. I couldn't wait to just take my dog out through the woods. I know every part of the woods, 11 years so long, never contemplating it was different to any other day. That day was just, it was just like you were in a nightmare. On the way back, I just saw a figure, a really tall, big figure, and I just fell on unease for some weird reason. As he marched past me on my left, I just was that relieved that he'd marched past, because as I looked up, he was looking straight ahead. As I heard the steps of the marching, it was heavy boots he had on. It was about 6 long, heavy steps. It just all of a sudden stopped. And as soon as it went silent, I knew. I heard running. I just knew he was running to me and I was going to be attacked. I just knew. And I turned around and as I seen his hand raised with a dumbbell in his hand, and he brought it down on my right-hand side of my head. It was so hard that it was almost like there was no pain. But I just felt all the blood, so I knew it was bad. I turned around and I thought I'll try and humanise myself. And I just looked him straight in the face and said, please don't do this. There was nothing. There was just evil, dark eyes. You never really understand it until you look evil in the face. So put my hands up to try and stop. His hand come down on me the next time. And that was when that hand got damaged in these fingers. And was screaming, shouting, help. And then after I screamed help as loud as I could, I just screamed until I just blacked out. And I just thought that was it.
Each year, the Parole Board conducts 25,000 reviews to ensure that prisoners released from jail do not go on to commit serious further offences. But there are many that slip through the net, with tragic consequences for people like grandmother Linda McDonald, who is left for dead after being attacked by a man with a dumbbell in the woods.
All of a sudden I heard a lady and she took my right hand and she says, you're going to be okay, there's an ambulance on its way.
The murder attempt on Linda in the woods is swiftly picked up on by local journalist Lindsay Hamilton.
Very, very quickly, Robbie McIntosh's name came into the frame.
Lindsay covered the story of a similar attack on a woman walking her dog in nearby Law Woods 15 years ago. Her name was Anne Nichol. Unlike Linda, she didn't survive.
It was summertime. Anne had been out walking her dog on the Law. The Law is very much a focal point in Dundee. There's a network of paths that people would frequently go for walks, walk their dogs, meet their friends, go on a nice day and walk around it. Also on the law at the time had been a 15-year-old boy called Robbie McIntosh. At some point during Anne's walk, she and Robbie McIntosh's paths crossed, and a frenzied attack took place. Stabbed her 29 times. Anne suffered wounds everywhere. It was to her neck, her face, her head. He stamped on her face as well, so it was particularly nasty. He was a schoolboy. That was what shocked everybody. He was carrying a weapon. I think he went out that night with an intention to commit some kind of violent offence, attack.
In 2002, McIntosh is given a life sentence, with the judge recommending he serve a minimum of 15 years behind bars for the murder of Anne Nichol.
The sentence might not have seemed as severe as people would have been hoping for. I think the explanation was that he was just 15 years old.
In 2015, Anne Nichol's family receive a letter from the Scottish Prison Service asking if they would have any objections to McIntosh being granted prison leave. They object. But on the 16th anniversary of the murder, he is granted a week's home leave in preparation for his release.
There was a public outcry. People were suggesting this guy he's pure evil. People were saying he will do something like this again. And they were completely right.
It is 5 days into that leave that he attacks Linda MacDonald.
I was so angry at that evil beast hurting my family. How dare he? How dare he think he's got that control? He could take me away from my family.
It doesn't take long for the police to link the two attacks, and they raid McIntosh's house.
Where he was living with his mum is walking distance to Templeton Woods, where he struck. It was there, it wasn't much longer after that police went to, because they were obviously aware that he'd been released into the community. And very quickly then, a neighbour came up with footage of Robbie leaving his mum's house that morning with his rucksack on his back. And it was in that rucksack that Robbie had the dumbbell.
At the High Court in Aberdeen, McIntosh is handed a lifelong restriction order for the attack on Linda MacDonald. Although eligible for parole in 5 years, the jury hear he may never be freed.
Prison services thought he is ready to be put back, back home. That's why they said they were beginning to allow him these periods out of prison to, I think, readjust to life back out on the street. There are a lot of people out there who believe they got that very, very wrong, that he was a pathological, evil killer who would never change.
When I found out who it was, and I found out what he did to that poor woman, he slaughtered that poor woman for nothing.
Matt and Linda are demanding answers from the Scottish Prison Service as to why McIntosh was considered safe for home leave without adequate supervision.
Why did they ever think that he was safe?
My father, John, came to the UK when I was about 4 because there was no work in Ireland, and they moved up north then to Sheffield.
John Gogarty then builds up a successful business as a property developer in Yorkshire. In July 2015, now retired, he is home alone when local man Ian Burley and his girlfriend break into his house and force him to hand over his bank card and PIN number before viciously stabbing him 69 times.
I was in Dublin Airport with 2 of my best friends. We were just about to walk down to our gate, and I got a phone call. It was my brother's mum. She told me to sit down, and she said to me, "Your father is dead." I think I dropped my phone and I kind of collapsed. When we got to the hotel, one of the detectives rang me and she said to me that, "I believe your father's been murdered."
10 days later, Ian Burley and his girlfriend Helen Nichols are brought in for questioning. CCTV evidence is discovered showing Nichols taking John Gogarty's money out of a nearby cash machine. Further CCTV shows Burley and Nichols together shortly after.
We were only home a day and he was arrested. He had been charged along with Helen Nichols for the murder of my father.
But this wasn't the first time Ian Burley had struck. In 1995, Burley, then in his early 20s, murdered and robbed another lone pensioner in his home, 69-year-old Maurice Hoyle, whom he bludgeoned to death with a whiskey bottle before stamping on his head. 18 years into his life sentence, Burley is released. He then goes on to murder Nicola's father just 18 months later.
I really couldn't believe it. My first initial thought was, why is he out? And how is he out allowed to do this again? We went to the trial for the murder of my father. I found that experience horrific. Having to sit there every day and look at Ian Burley and Helen Nichols was quite horrifying. He sat there and showed no remorse whatsoever. I think at times, he was actually laughing. And it's very hard to compose yourself when you're confronted with all these harrowing details about what's happened to your dad.
High on crack cocaine, Ian Burley has stabbed Nicola's father with such force that he smashes John Gogarty's ribs.
He gave my father a brutal death. So you're left with images and just everything like what my father went through will always kind of haunt me, you know.
On the 7th of December 2015, Ian Burley is sentenced to a whole life term for the murder of John Gogarty, with the trial judge saying he would never be allowed to leave prison again. His girlfriend, Helen Nichols, is also given a life sentence of 20 years for her role in his murder.
Judge did say that he will die in prison this time, that he will never get out, but I don't think he should have been released in the first place. To do the same thing again and traumatise another family.
In March 2018, the Ministry of Justice performs an internal review into the circumstances of Burley's release and at whether there were failings by agencies involved in and after his release from prison.
Somebody from the probation service contacted me to ask if I wanted a meeting with them. They showed us a report, about 11 pages long. But while I was reading it, alarm bells were kind of going off in my head because the stuff that I was reading were just about him and his breach of licence again and again.
Part of Ian Burley's licence conditions were for him not to take drugs, and yet he tested positive twice for methadone and refused to provide a urine sample when requested to do so.
I just couldn't understand why, if he was breaching all these conditions, why he was still out and nothing was kind of being done. And that's how I got to be in contact with Kim.
Kim Harrison is a human rights lawyer specialising in public inquiries and has been helping Nicola and her family prepare for a full inquest into the circumstances of her father's death.
I was contacted by Nicola. Her father had been murdered in horrendous circumstances. She'd had a meeting with the probation service and she was led to believe from that meeting that there may have been failings. She wasn't allowed to take any documents away from that meeting, so she was quite confused about what she should do and where to turn next for help and support.
I knew there was more questions that I had that I needed answered. And if I didn't get it done, they would never be answered.
The inquest should provide answers as to whether there were failings which contributed to his death.
The evidence that we have suggests that Ian Burley wasn't given a psychiatric assessment before he was released, which we find incredible. At the time of his release, he was downgraded from a high risk to a medium risk, despite the fact that on temporary releases, he'd breached licence conditions and had to be recalled to prison. He then was released and went to live in the community. He got into debt with drugs. Things spiralled out of control for him, and he decided to commit the murder of Mr. Gogarty for financial gain.
It's just like letting a wild dog loose. He's completely dangerous. And it's not fair. There needs to be stricter laws, so people don't have to go through this.
It's been 2 years since Linda from Dundee was attacked in the woods, and she is now preparing for her serious case review into why her attempted killer was allowed to be released to kill again.
It's been 20 months and I feel I'm getting there. I mean, it's a fight all the time, and I maybe have a bad day. My biggest problem wasn't just, okay, I suffer migraines and dizziness. It was more the nightmares. Certain things trigger a flashback, certain noises, smells, situations. I keep taking it as a chapter and say, well, maybe by Christmas. And then I get to Christmas and I go, well, maybe by the summer. And it's now going to be like coming up to the 2-year bit. And there's lots of things. There's things like the serious case investigation. I think, well, once that's complete, I'll get closure. I want them to be transparent. I want them to admit they've made mistakes. This is just a folder I keep from everything from the Scottish Prison Service to try and understand, you know, why somebody so dangerous would be let out. I believe there was no monitoring in place. There was nothing. And I think there was just serious flaws. This is all the prison rules, Scottish prison rules. How would they know or not know whether he was abiding by these rules unless someone was monitoring him? Unless there was a monitoring in place, unless there was spot checks, why would they know if he was going to break rules or not? Why did they let these dangerous killers out on home leave and they've not even been before the parole board? Is this meant to make me feel better? That, you know, this is your system and you're telling me this system works when it clearly doesn't? And my worry is, you know, how many more are slipping through the net? How many more are they getting it wrong with? Well, this is all over Britain, that they're just letting these dangerous killers out to kill again.
It's now 18 months since Amy's mother, Janet Scott, was brutally murdered by a man who was deemed safe to be released from prison. Today, she's meeting an advocate who is helping her prepare for a full inquest into her mother's death.
Hello.
A series of failings by the parole board and probation service have already been identified.
Take a seat.
In November 2018, at an internal serious case review, the Ministry of Justice apologised for unacceptable failings by the probation service who failed to act on Janet Scott's fears about Mellors before her death.
As far as like the coroner's court, I know quite a few of us are very anxious about it.
You're bound to be. It isn't a blame game. What we're looking for is for the failings to be recognised and addressed. Yeah, so it's not a case of you should have done this or you shouldn't have done that. It's a case of what went wrong and what can we do to stop it happening in future. So hopefully you're going to get a lot more answers that you haven't got at the moment. I think Amy and her family are hoping to have many questions answered
Why was their mum not kept safe by the agencies that exist to keep her safe, especially with the amount that was known about Simon Mellor's history and his behaviour.
But for now, Amy and her family's unanswered questions will have to wait until a date is set for the inquest.
We blame the justice system and the parole board. If anyone actually understood, then they'd do an awful lot more to prevent this from happening. All you've got left are photographs. There's no videos.
You're 16 and you don't remember what your mum sounds like. It's not fair. The little things people take for granted, isn't it? It's not like I didn't just lose my mum that day. I lost my best friend. She was someone you always knew was going to be there no matter what.
Nicola Gogarty has been fighting for 3 years for her inquest into the death of her father, John. Today, they are finally getting the coroner's conclusions.
Really do hope that the coroner does find failings with the probation service.
We've got a separate room so you have your family room.
I've told them all to be there at 1. It's just better that we're all there at the same time. We just don't know what he's going to say. I obviously do think there is failings. But again, so I'm kind of living in hope that we get a good result.
Nicola wants to know why Ian Burley wasn't properly monitored by the probation service and why, despite 2 final warnings about breaching his licence conditions, he wasn't sent back to prison.
All that Nicola and the family have sought to do from the very first is to try and get to the truth of what happened. And understanding why something happened can be very important to start to go through that grieving process.
I hope it will give us a little bit of closure.
After a long wait, the hearing is over.
Yes, the coroner, Chris Dorris, spent 45 minutes outlining his conclusions this afternoon. The family of John Gogarty were in court to hear those conclusions. His killer, Ian Burley, defied his licence conditions within weeks of being released from jail. Testing for drink and drugs on him gradually reduced over time, and he took to both those substances, the court was told, without it becoming apparent to his offender manager.
The coroner concluded that the probation service had missed opportunities to take action, and a lack of adequate monitoring probably contributed to Mr. Gogarty's death.
We're very happy with the result that we got today. We do feel a little bit still let down by the system.
It's been a long battle to get here. Do you believe, clearly you believe that you shouldn't have had to have this fight to get to the inquest in the first place?
No, I don't think any family should have to fight like this. It's been over 3 years that we're doing this, and it has an effect on a family when you're trying to fight to get something, I think, that should be quite automatic in a system.
It's clear that there were a number of failings, that lessons need to be learned, and indeed a couple of those failings could have prevented Mr. Gogarty's death.
It's bittersweet because I am really happy with the result, but it's just hard to hear that there was so many failings, and I just don't think they did their job correctly, and I do think, that my dad would really still be here if things were done right.